This video is sponsored by Movie Palette.
Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Russell Crowe is the Pope's Exorcist.
An American family, Alex Asso's Julia, with her daughter Amy, played by Laurel Marsden, and son Henry, played by Peter de Souza Fairney, moved to Spain into San Sebastian Abbey, which Julia inherited from her late husband, where Henry becomes possessed. The case attracts the attention of the Vatican and the Pope, played by Franco Nero, who sends his chief exorcist, Father Gabriele Amorth, played by Russell Crowe, to investigate. Amorth soon discovers that the Abbey itself harbours dark secrets linking back to the Vatican.
The Pope's Exorcist is directed by Julius Avery, who previously gave us the fun World War II horror flick Overlord, which I actually quite enjoyed, and the Sylvester Stallone superhero movie Samaritan. The Pope's Exorcist is inspired by true events, which is to say that some of the facts are true, but most of it is completely made up. The true part is there was a chief exorcist of the Vatican, and that position was filled by Father Gabriele Amorth. The film is nominally based on the two books that he wrote about his life, but mostly it just takes his name and plonks him in a completely fictional story. This is not the first time that Amorth has inspired a feature film. He was previously the subject of the documentary The Devil and Father Amorth, which was helmed by William Friedkin, director of The Exorcist, and also curiously has a writing credit for Mark Kermode. This was a very poorly received documentary, not least of which because Friedkin was accused of doctoring his footage, particularly in the exorcism sequence where the possessed person speaks with an obviously digitally distorted and post-processed voice. There's also a moment where Friedkin claims that he encountered a possessed person in a church, but magically none of the cameras worked at that particular moment. The Pope's Exorcist really comes down to how much do you believe that possession and exorcism are actually real things, and honestly, I'd have far more respect for the movie if they just came out and said, inspired by some absolute bollocks. Perhaps the biggest central attraction of the Pope's Exorcist is seeing Academy Award winner Russell Crowe in an exorcism movie. Perhaps the biggest coup for a movie of this type since Anthony Hopkins inexplicably decided to star in The Rite. And I know that Crowe has made some very odd career choices over the years, especially lately, but even so, his performance in this film is absolutely bewildering. It bears comparison to late career Oliver Reed, and Crowe has this very weird thing where he both seems to be taking the role absolutely deadly seriously, but also seems to be sending himself up simultaneously. It's really quite odd. You never quite know whether he actually is completely on board with this, or whether he knows that this is absolutely ridiculous hokum. Take the fact that he spends a great chunk of this movie riding around on a little tiny Vespa moped, which looks particularly comical under Crowe, and the movie seems to imply at one point that he actually rides that all the way from the Vatican in Italy to Spain. In fact, I would almost like to see a road movie literally documenting Father Amorth going all the way on a little tiny Vespa like that. There are also several scenes where Crowe goes around to people going, cuckoo, which really throws you for a loop when the rest of the scene is him steadfastly defending his faith and resolve, as well as his profession. But Father Amorth is actually depicted as a fairly jovial fellow, and that's partly by design, as he explains to someone else, the devil does not like jokes. And if you thought that was a terrible accent, that's almost an exact impersonation of Russell Crowe's Italian accent in this movie. And Russell Crowe is notorious for absolutely atrocious accents. You think of his Robin Hood, or last year's Thor Love and Thunder, where his Greek accent is perhaps one of the worst accents I have ever heard in any movie in my life. And Crowe in The Pope's Exorcist brings his voice down to a hushed whisper a lot of the time, seemingly in the belief that if he speaks at a borderline mumble, that makes the accent more convincing. Like if I speak in low, slow tones like this, I sound more like an Italian person. I do not like lattes. No, Russell, it's absolutely appalling, but at least Chris Pratt can breathe a sigh of relief that he doesn't have the worst Italian accent in the multiplex at the moment. But despite the fact that Crowe has an accent that's straight out of a comedy sketch, it does appear that he has actually learned Italian for the role, because for the first act of the movie, a lot of his dialogue is in that language, which of course makes sense because he's in the Vatican. But you would think for a movie like this, they'd mostly just have people talking in English with big, broad accents. But this is something the movie actually keeps up all the way to when Amorth travels to Spain, at which point he mostly speaks in English. So that is a surprising amount of effort for a cheesy B-movie, but that means that Crowe's performance is pitched somewhere between Max von Sydow in The Exorcist and Leslie Nielsen in Repossessed. And I wish the rest of the movie was as fascinatingly odd as Crowe's performance, because he really does enliven the proceedings. But if you took Crowe at the centre of this movie, you'd have a bog-standard, by-the-numbers exorcism movie. Now, I have seen enough exorcism films to admit that I've got a bit of a grudge against them at this point. Anytime I learn that an exorcism movie is coming out, I go, oh, another one? They're all the bloody same. And that's not quite true. That's a little bit of a harsh generalisation. Every so often there will be an exorcism movie that does something maybe a little bit different with the concept, like the Shudder movie that came out recently, Attachment. That's a very different example of an exorcism movie, and trying to do something maybe a bit unique with it. The Post-Exorcist is not one of those movies. If you've seen an exorcism film in the last, I don't know, several decades, you know exactly the bag of tricks that Avery and his team have brought to this movie. Like, the first act with the family is basically a condensed version of the opening half of The Exorcist, in that they move into the Abbey and strange things start happening, people get hurt, and then Peter starts behaving very strangely. He starts speaking in this low, deep tone, taunting them, and he's got these horrific injuries that start accumulating. They take him to doctors, they put him in an MRI machine, and no one knows what to do with him. It completely defies medical science, and then it attracts the attention of the Vatican. All this stuff is all very familiar if you've seen The Exorcist, and it does seem like Avery is not just aping scenes from that movie. It seems like it's actually a purposeful attempt to try and homage The Exorcist, in that most of the big gags of that movie are actually in the Post-Exorcist. You've got the bit where letters appear out of the child's chest. You've got moments where characters' heads turn around. You've got all those kind of tricks that you famously have seen in the movie. Whether or not that was an intentional homage to the forebearer of this genre, the fact is that all of these movies do those exact same tricks, so the line between purposeful homage and just outright copying The Exorcist has blurred extremely thin, to the point of being absolutely indistinguishable. So if it is meant to be in any way reverential to that movie, that is completely lost, because all I was thinking was, yeah, I've seen this before, I've seen this before, I've seen this before. The Exorcist has been copied so many times, it's 50 years old at this point. It has been done to death. Even people who have never seen The Exorcist will be familiar with all the gags from that movie, because they've been done in countless emulators over the years, to the point where they might not even be aware that they originated in The Exorcist to begin with. None of these movies bring anything new to the table, and it all feels extremely played out. As I go through yet another possession scene using all the stock tropes of these kind of stories, I just go, oh, ho-hum. It's not scary in the slightest. What I will say, in Avery's very minor defence, that the possession scenes are quite well staged. They do have a kind of roller coaster quality about them. The camera work is very lively. But even so, that is really scraping for compliments, especially because, in terms of comparison, saying that The Post-Exorcist is a better attempt at trying to copy The Exorcist than The Devil Inside is barely even a compliment to begin with. I mean, it's a very bad sign when the possession scenes are more funny than anything else. The movie strives so hard to have the kind of shocking dialogue that you heard in The Exorcist, but mostly it comes as laughably try-hard. There's a moment where the kid grabs his mother and goes,
"You never breastfed me, mother."
At which point, I had to hold my breath from laughing, because otherwise I'd burst out in hysterics in the middle of the auditorium, and I genuinely wondered at several points whether this was meant to be a dark comedy that hadn't advertised itself properly. But no, the more the movie proceeds, the more it starts taking itself seriously, and the more that it continues along, the more that Avery goes, "Oh, well, you didn't think that one was scary? Well, let's just turn up the volume knob." And the movie just gets louder and louder and louder. Really, that was the most draining thing about The Pope's Exorcist. It's such an obnoxiously abrasive movie in terms of its soundtrack that I actually caught not just myself, but several people around me checking their watches to see how much time the movie had left, because they were as equally bored and stupefied as I was, going through the same old motions of these movies as we've seen countless times before. I also had a hard time taking the possession scene seriously because I started to think to myself, hang on, that demon voice sounds very familiar. Is that Ralph Ineson? And it turned out, yes, it was. It is Ralph Ineson of The Witch and of Game of Thrones fame. His very uniquely identifiable tones are the demon in this movie. Unfortunately, those weren't the credits that I was thinking of in that exact moment, because what I was actually thinking was, does that demon sound like the voiceover narrator for Salvage Hunters the Restorers? Which is also something that Ineson does. So I was kind of expecting him to suddenly start talking very soothingly about restoring wood panelling or something like that. Which again, kind of takes away the scare factor out of a devil. And if you're going to be silly, at least lean into the camp of it all. That's when Crowe's performance is at its best. But you've also got certain other elements that lean into that sparkle. Like you've got Franco Nero as the Pope in this movie. That's right, Django himself is playing the Pope, which is an absolutely inspired bit of casting, and about midway through, the Pope has to be escorted to hospital in a minor subplot because he too starts seemingly becoming possessed for some reason. I think they just realised that having Franco Nero on the set of their film for a couple of days and only standing around in a church for the majority of their running time was a complete waste of his talents, so we have a moment where the Pope vomits blood over someone, which is actually more funnier in my description than it is on screen. But nevertheless, I wish the film had the temerity to have more of those kind of wild moments. I kept wondering through The Pope's Exorcist, where is the guy that directed Overlord? The guy that made that movie that had such a gonzo premise and just completely went OTT with it, slathering the film with gore. There are occasional moments where you see Avery popping up in the direction of The Pope's Exorcist, but alas, it's stifled largely by the material and a lot of really quite jarring, janky editing a lot of the time. Instead, the movie focuses on a vast Vatican conspiracy that there's some dark secret connected to the Abbey that Amorth is going to uncover, and believe me, that is by far the least interesting aspect of the movie. Seeing Crowe walking around these dark catacombs is about the point where my mind really started to wander, and where it wandered to was largely me contemplating how this movie is opening in a much different time than how The Exorcist did. The Exorcist opened at a point in time where a lot more people were openly devoutly religious, particularly of the Christian faith, particularly in the US and in the UK, whereas today's audiences are a lot more agnostic and skeptical about their faith, and as a result, who actually believes this stuff? The Exorcist really did stir people up back in its day, but the Pope's Exorcist not only feels familiar, but it feels like it's playing to a kind of faith that I don't think really exists, especially with its belief in the Vatican, which has been profoundly shaken in many people's eyes due to a number of scandals. And what I think is really distasteful about the Pope's Exorcist is that it tries to address that. There are lines of dialogue that kind of reference those things in a very ill-judged manner, but also you've got the results of this subplot where Amorth uncovers connections to various different scandals related to the church, like of course the Spanish Inquisition, and the movie tries to imply that these are the result of demons, of possessions, kind of tainting the influence of the church, which, you know, kind of feels a bit offensive when you try to apply that to maybe certain other things that have come out about the church in the last few years. You know, those weren't the actions of, you know, some predatory human beings. Oh no, they were possessed. Those weren't those actions. It's an insinuation that is in such poor taste that you really wish the movie just hadn't brought it up at all. Much like how a lot of the film deals with guilt and sin, and how those are ways for demons to attack you. So one of the other things the movie takes deadly seriously is a subplot where Amorth feels shame for the fact that he did not treat a mentally ill young woman who believed that she was possessed, but Amorth didn't think so, and that had tragic consequences. This largely exists so she can attack him as the demon takes her form, but nevertheless, it does remind the audience that a lot of people that claim to be possessed are actually just severely mentally ill, and the movie kind of feigns in that direction. There's a line of dialogue where someone says, well, 98% of cases that Amorth investigates are referred on to psychiatrists, and only 2% are deemed worthy of an exorcism. But even so, even trying to add an air of legitimacy to any of this just feels really uncomfortable. I just think the movie would have been better just treating itself with the tongue-in-cheek nature that it tries to have at several points, rather than also trying to be serious about this subject matter, because most audience members probably feel that this is rather fantastical and ridiculous, so just play it as such. You can't have these scenes where you're dealing with quite heavy subject matter alongside scenes where a naked woman explodes, and also an ending that seems to be setting up for the Vatican cinematic universe. The Pope's Exorcist sounds like it should be so bad it's good. Mostly, it's just bad. Russell Crowe definitely brings a hamminess to the title role, but even he can only enliven so much of the same possession tropes you've seen in countless other movies of this type. The only frightening thing about the Pope's Exorcist is just how dull and boring it is a lot of the time, especially because it can't even decide what tone it wants to be. Some of it is very misplaced in its seriousness, and then other bits are almost like comedy territory. And so, as a result, the movie largely has its communion wafer and eats it.
You've probably seen this swish thing in the background of the entire video. This is a movie palette. It takes the colour tone of an entire movie and turns it into this artwork. So each of these lines represents a scene or sequences from the entire movie. In this case, this is Terminator 2 Judgment Day. And if you would like a movie palette of your own, then you can go to moviepalette.com and use the code FilmBrain15 to get 15% off your order. And thanks again to Movie Palette for sponsoring this video.
If you like this review and you want to support my work, you can give me a tip at my Ko-fi page, or my YouTube Super Thanks feature, which is right below the video. Or you can buy some of my merch from my TeePublic page. Or you can bless my Patreon, where you can see my videos early among other perks, including access to my Discord server. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.